Timothy Ferris here with a few words about tolerance, about toleration. An important concept, although you don't hear the word much these days. Last time anyone used it in conversation with me was about 6 months ago when my physician inquired as to how I was tolerating taking vitamins. The word comes from the Latin meaning to put up with, and a recent dictionary definition calls toleration a disposition to allow the existence of beliefs and practices differing from one's own, sympathetic understanding of the beliefs of others and their opinions without necessarily accepting them. If you've been following the political lectures in this series, you know that I've been defining liberalism in its classical original sense as the philosophy developed largely by John Locke in the 17th century and written into the constitutions of the United States and the other liberal democracies. Liberalism means freedom. It is the philosophy of maximizing personal freedom, including the freedom of individuals to elect their own leaders. John Locke was a forward-looking thinker. He understood that if liberal democracy was to be a reality, public education would need to be paid for by taxpayer funds so that everyone had the education necessary to make intelligent decisions at election time. A very forward-looking idea at a time when substantial numbers of the population of even the most advanced countries were still illiterate. And Locke emphasized the importance of tolerance, of putting up with people who look different than you do, talk differently than you do, and have different political opinions than you do. Without tolerance, a liberal democracy would descend into warring factions. This was a great concern of the American founders and remains a concern of everyone who supports democracy to this day. It's not easy to be tolerant, and even John Locke had trouble with it for many years. He was a believing Christian and for many years felt that one couldn't really tolerate atheists or agnostics because he was concerned that if they came into court and swore on a Bible, it wouldn't mean anything since they didn't believe as he did in the tenets of Christianity. But he eventually came around on that point, as have literally tens to hundreds of millions of others, as living in liberal democracies has shown them the way to be more tolerant of others. I'm recording this lecture in the year 2022, and we're in the midst of intolerant times. On the political right wing of a conventional one-dimensional spectrum, where in a one-dimensional term we would call people conservatives, there are a great many Americans who aren't conservatives at all, but have taken a radical stance of intolerance toward their fellow citizens. Their behavior has included lying about basic facts of everything from politics to science, of pretending, for instance, that global warming is a hoax, of blaming problems on some group such as illegal immigrants who don't vote, pretending they're responsible for all our ills, and perhaps most seriously, of claiming that free and fair elections, the basis of liberal democracy, are rigged, making such claims before the elections are held, making them after the elections are held, and continuing to make them even after dozens and dozens of court cases have confirmed that the election was not in fact rigged and that the outcome is legally secure. This form of intolerance has gone so far as trying to deliberately subvert fair elections, justifying one's violent acts on the basis of lies. On the left end of the traditional spectrum, often called liberal, although intolerant leftists are not liberals at all, we find similarly intolerant behavior. I'm not claiming that it's equal on one side or another, nor would such claim make much difference, but all these offenses are serious. They include literally canceling speaking appearances by those who differ from the ideological dogma on the grounds that just hearing an argument, a reasoned argument that violates such beliefs, somehow hurts people, somehow damages them, and therefore should not be allowed. But free speech is essential to liberal democracy. In extremely ideological regimes such as the National Socialism of the Nazis and the International Socialism of the Communists, those differing in any detail from the regnant ideology were not just canceled, they were often rounded up, jailed, sent into exile, or executed. Tens of thousands of people were executed simply for holding beliefs not approved of by the state. Also, from the left end of the spectrum, we find such intolerance as claiming that certain sorts of people, certain colors or genders or people of certain backgrounds are privileged in their speech and should be listened to, while those of other colors or backgrounds are to be ignored. And of course, because all ideology involves blaming people for the inevitable failure of society to conform properly as predicted to the ideology, one ends up blaming one's fellow citizens, those just a little different from oneself, for everything that's going wrong with the intolerant regime. Behind all this intolerance is ignorance. As David Deutsch puts it, evil is ignorance. In this case, ignorance of the actual complexity of other people, an egomaniacal notion that one's own complexity is somehow special and is not reflected amongst one's fellow citizens. A passion for comparing the imagined perfection of one's ideological beliefs with the messy realities of human life as it really is. It's kind of like the one-dimensional spectrum itself. In order to be intolerant, you have to pretend that some very limited view is what matters, and that the full complexity of the wider universe is somehow to be ruled by this limited set of beliefs. But people are too complicated to be dismissed simply because they hold certain opinions. As the old saying has it, each person contains a universe. The only universe any of us ever have is the one we're able to construct within our minds. And it's our obligation to try to construct a universe that, insofar as we can, accurately reflects the objective facts. On a personal note, I grew up in the South, and part of my childhood was spent in extremely poor rural communities in the South. Schools were still racially segregated, and racism at that time was still commonplace in the South, particularly amongst the poorest and least educated whites. And I remember one day I was about 12 years old, and I was standing waiting for a ride by a dirt road with three classmates in the wretched school that we all attended. They were white boys, and they were all racists in the sense that they had already learned the tenets of the racist worldview that their parents had taught them. And yet they had doubts. They were discussing how, for instance, as one of them put it, gee, you know, if you break down by the side of the road, a lot of times white guys will just pass you by, and the first person to stop and help you will be a black man, for whom, of course, he used the N-word. I always remembered that moment because they were starting to realize the basis of intolerance, which is a lack of understanding, failing to understand just how complicated people are and how complicated and subtle the world of human interactions is. They had begun to realize, as I hope we're all beginning to understand better all the time, that to be tolerant is to appreciate the limitations of our own understanding. Thanks for listening. See you next time.